We are back. Giants Bazeball, past, present, and future. I'm Ralph Tyko. Tim Haller and Patrick Quinlan are both on assignment, but I'm not exactly flying solo. My guest is the illustrious returnee to the airwaves, Bruce McGowan, Bay Area icon and sportscasting legend.
Well, I'm an icon in my own home, that's for sure. maybe not all the time, but some of the time.
Or even in your own mind, in your own
right.
bedroom, whatever it takes.
Whatever it takes, Ralph. You know, you get to a certain point in your life and your career, and you just say, this hasn't been a bad run. You know, it's nothing to write a novel about. But I've been lucky to have covered a lot of big events and traveled a lot and covered the Bay Area sports scene really closely for the better part of 40 years, and it's been a privilege. And I'm still doing a little bit right now. I'm still covering some NFL and Major League Baseball and the Warriors, so we're having a good time. Mixing it up.
And the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network, where we're going to honor 3 Giants who passed away in this last year. Jimmy Davenport, who an illustrious third baseman, Jim Ray Hart, Monte Irvin, New York Giants, and basically 4 because although he wasn't really known as the San Francisco Giants, John Orsino, who came up and played on the 1962 NL Championship Giant team, he did.
Interesting thing about John Orsino, too, I believe, and I'm not sure, you'd have to check on this, but I believe he grew up down the peninsula. I think the Giants had a couple guys on that team that were sort of bench warmers. Another guy by the name of Bob Garibaldi, who was a bonus baby pitcher out of Santa Clara, who later became an outstanding college basketball official for many years in the Pac-10. And then it became, of course, the Pac-12. I think Bob retired a few years ago. Bob was just a bonus baby rookie, 22-year-old kid who actually won a game, a very big game. Anytime you win any games in a pennant-winning season, when you win the thing by a single game, well, they had to win a playoff against the Dodgers to win it. I mean, any win is big. So they all had a little part. That's the great thing about baseball, you know. As you know, Ralph, a 25-man team, it is that much of a factor. But
28, 29.
Yeah, exactly. 7 or 8 guys come up out of the minors, or some guy. Remember Michael Morse, who joined the Giants in 2014, and out of nowhere, this guy put together an amazing season, and a legend was born. And that's the thing that's always intrigued me about baseball is you have moments and players who have that one great moment. Maybe they don't have a great career. Maybe they just, are sort of a journeyman. But like Bobby Thompson was a good player, the great Giant who won the pennant in 51 with his home run off the Dodgers. But at the same time, he wasn't a Hall of Famer. Yet he had that moment that was iconic. So,
the newly departed as well.
That's right. He died this past year. It's been a rough year for a lot of deaths in the world of not only sports but movies. Music, politics. It's been a tough year, 2016. We're looking forward to a better year in 2017. I felt really badly with the Debbie Reynolds, Carrie Fisher thing the other day, Ralph. That was really sad, back to back like that. But these things happen. It's part of the cycle of life.
Overwhelming grief. Debbie Reynolds, we forget what you talk about icons.
Oh my gosh,
she was a megastar. She was such a good dancer. She was back in the days of Fred Astaire and Gene Kelly and That's Entertainment. And
well, you think about it, Ralph. She broke into show business when she was just in her teens. She had her first movie at 19, and then Singing in the Rain. She was only 20 years old when she was paired opposite Gene Kelly and Donald O'Connor. What a great! I mean, when you have that early opportunity, it's kind of like being a rookie thrown into the fray, and you win a Super Bowl. Your rookie year. It's that kind of a thing, and she had some rough times, away from the business with her personal relationships.
Leaving her for
Elizabeth Taylor. And then she had a couple of husbands, one of whom, basically had a gambling problem and lost everything. And she was literally for a few months living in her car because she was completely flat broke. But she was always a resilient woman. It's so sad. Her daughter, I think, was probably more intelligent, but maybe not quite as talented. But Carrie had the substance abuse problem and the manic depressive problem, which, dogged her all her life. Very interesting people, though.
Play havoc with one of my hero, Paul Simon, who's married.
Oh yeah, that's right. That's right.
And a cup of tea. Wow.
Boy, oh boy. She did not look good the last few years, Ralph. If you saw her being interviewed, whereas Debbie Reynolds, I think, despite all the problems she had and the ups and downs in her career, she stayed pretty steady. She was a tough little gal, and her daughter, just when you're thrown into the fishbowl and you're expected to, you're doing great things at an early age, and your parents are both, great performers. There's a little extra pressure, and who knows? It's not unusual for children of great stars to have problems, and it's true in sports too. You see it with certain athletes.
Talent as well. She was a great writer. And,
no question.
Very funny, very good timing, and she played that role of throughout her lifetime as just kind of a camp thing. I don't think she deserved it. She thought she ever deserved it on her merits as an actress, but it served her well, and she lived an interesting.
She lived a full life. Yeah. I'm not sure if she had any other children besides Carrie Fisher. I don't know about that, but I do know that they had a kind of a stormy relationship. But it sounds as if the two of them made peace. I saw an interview with them a couple of years ago on Oprah, and I was, you could see there was a little tension between them, but there was a lot of love there. And obviously, when Carrie Fisher died of the heart attack on that plane, I guess she was still alive when they put her in the hospital, but she never came back and regained consciousness. It just destroyed her mom. Her mom just couldn't handle it, and that kind of put her over the edge. So, these things happen, as we say, Ralph. You have to be philosophical. The cycle of life. Debbie Reynolds had a great life and certainly accomplished a lot. And Carrie Fisher, despite dying at a young age, relatively speaking, you have to say she had a great impact, not only as a writer, but just as a social commentator and, a very bright woman who's kind of set the tone for a lot of the strong women characters in the movies in the 1970s and 80s.
I give her a lot of credit. Again, she was a very talented person. And when your parents are both superstars like that, reminds me of Frank Sinatra Jr. and a number of folks are very tough to follow. Not just in entertainment, sports as well.
No question. Ralph, it's fun to talk about a little entertainment here because I think I've told you this, and maybe I haven't. Maybe your listeners don't know this. It's not that big a deal, but it's kind of interesting. My dad's father was a very prominent movie producer in Hollywood from 1932 to about 1947. He was also a socialist. So he was pretty much blacklisted. He would have been blacklisted had he not left Hollywood in 47 and go to UCLA to become the dean of the Theater Arts School. But Kenneth McGowan produced 50 films for 20th Century Fox and RKO Pictures, including Little Women with Katharine Hepburn, Young Mr. Lincoln with Henry Fonda. He did Lloyds of London, which of course was a big, at that time a big production. And then he did one with Alfred Hitchcock called Lifeboat with Tallulah Bankhead. And there's a great story. I know I'm going off on a tangent about this, but I got to tell you this one. It's real quick. It's really funny. Tallulah Bankhead was making probably more than the entire cast, the rest of the cast in this movie, Lifeboat, which was set basically in a lifeboat. It was about a bunch of Allied people, from England and America and various other parts of the world during the Second World War who were unfortunately submarined with a torpedo and knocked into the water, and so they're trying to survive. Tallulah Bankhead is this enterprising kind of smart-ass journalist, and there's a bunch of other people aboard, and they bring aboard the German U-boat captain is actually saved because he gets I guess his boat gets shelled and they lose their boat too, so he's aboard, and it's kind of an interesting story. But what happened was Tallulah was very, very much of the kind of person who wanted all the attention on her, and she loved male attention. She was probably in her mid to late 30s at this time, and the set itself, the lifeboat, was set up in a huge tank with what's called a cycloma behind it, simulating the horizon of the ocean. And the people were supposed to climb up this series of stairs to get there, which they did. Well, she would ascend these stairs for every shoot, and she was never wearing any underpants. And so all of the crew on the shoot, all these guys, young guys, would be looking up, and she would be flashing, making sure that they saw her. And so it really started to bother some of the other actors. So one of them went over to Alfred Hitchcock, and he said, "Mr. Hitchcock, you've got to rein in Tallulah. You know, she's driving these, you know, she's driving the crew crazy here with her behavior. And Hitchcock just sighed and put his hands to his face, and he looked over, and my grandfather was sitting behind a chair. My grandfather was a very quiet, easygoing, professorial kind of guy who could just, you know, he had a disarming sort of a personality. He put everybody at ease. He'd say, and Hitchcock looked at me and goes, "Have him go talk to McGowan." Or have her go talk to McGowan. And my grandfather told that story.
Voice in your family head has to be a great story.
Yeah, it's a fun story. I heard that from my aunt, who was Kenneth's daughter, and I wish I had gotten to know him better because he was a fascinating character. You know, he was a socialist. He always voted on the socialist ticket. He was called before the House Un-American Activities Committee and would certainly have been blacklisted out of Hollywood had he still been active. But he was, by that time, had transitioned over to teaching at UCLA.
That just out of curiosity, because
he just always was. He was an intellectual. He was somebody who always looked at things very, very, you know, sort of in a far-sighted fashion. He always liked to consider all possibilities, and he grew up in a very sort of a normal working-class family in St. Louis. But for some reason, he gravitated towards people like Eugene Debs and Norman Thomas, who were prominent socialist leaders who both ran for president back in the first half of the 20th century. He always voted the socialist ticket. And in those days, it wasn't such a, you know, up until probably the 1950s or late 40s, it wasn't such a bad thing, you know, according to most Americans, to be a socialist, because there were a lot of good things that the socialists pushed for, you know, unions and equal pay and opportunity. And I think that changed, you know, once we got into the Cold War. So he, you know, kind of was a little standoffish about getting involved with, you know, becoming any kind of a protester, but he did pretty much take the fifth and not name names.
Between communism and socialism.
That's exactly. Oh, it scared a lot of people. But, you know, he lived a normal life after that. He taught at UCLA. He developed the theater arts school there, was very, very proud of that. He really enjoyed teaching. He wrote several books on the theater and lived a very full life. And, you know, my dad got to grow up in Hollywood and be around all these iconic figures. And my dad never talked about it that much, but later in life I asked him questions, and it was really interesting to hear the stories. One time he got to go on a coast-to-coast flight, which in those days was pretty rare, and it would take you about 8 hours, and sitting right next to him and talking with him the entire trip, this is back in about 1933 or 34, just before he died, was Will Rogers, who was an iconic figure, you know, the sort of the Mark Twain of his era. And my dad said all they talked about was flying, because my dad became a pilot during the Second World War, and Will Rogers was a pilot, and my dad loved to talk about flying, and so it was fun. You know, I can't imagine what it must have been like. I'd love to have been a fly on the wall hearing conversation from Will Rogers, you know, because...
How'd your family get from Southern California to Northern California?
Well, after the war, my dad went back to graduate school and got his degree in architecture, and then they decided they wanted to come back to the West Coast, because even though my dad was from the East originally, he preferred the weather and the more open environment, and he loved the outdoors. So they didn't want to live in L.A. because L.A. was becoming a big, thriving metropolis. So they had friends in San Francisco, and they moved here with my then young brother, who was only about 2 years old, and I was born here and raised here, and so very lucky to have lived here all these years. But he always considered himself a Bay Area guy, even though my dad did live in L.A. and did live in, you know, went to Harvard, both undergrad and graduate school, and was raised in New York City as a young boy in the 20s. But, you know, a lot of people move around a lot. I moved around a lot. I moved to Denver for college. I went and lived in Portland and Seattle and New York for my career. So, you know, it's good to see the world, and I think my dad was able to do a lot of that, and, you know, that's a blessing.
Nice. What would you pass on to your daughter in the way of career advice?
I'd say stay out of well, I wouldn't say stay out. If she wanted to get in broadcasting, which she doesn't, it's a little early anyway. She's only 11. I wouldn't. You know, I don't know where broadcasting is going right now, Ralph. There are a lot of opportunities. There are a lot more things that are going on, like what we're doing right now. You know, 20 years ago, what we're doing right now, this podcast, was inconceivable. So there are a lot of other opportunities out there, and you just have to kind of figure out ahead of time where they are. I think when I hit my 50s, all this new technology was just really picking up steam, And while I tried to get aboard with it, the consolidation of the media, which, as you know, has been, I think, a disaster for this country, and I don't think many people talk about it because they're so distracted by other things. But, basically radio stations in this country now are most of them, probably 90% of them are owned basically by 5 companies. That's not good. That's not good for business. That's not good for the consumer. That's not good for people who want information. So I'm just glad, for instance, KNBR, which, still gets good number of listeners, compared to the 1990s, compared to today. I mean, a lot of the young kids today, and I say anybody born after 1980 is, in my mind, I guess, a young kid, they're, probably listening to satellite radio or their iPods, and they're not listening that much to radio anymore. So, up until the 90s, I think that wasn't the case. Maybe even the mid-90s, but that began to change, and, radio has had to adapt, and it has to a certain degree, but along the way there've been a lot of casualties, a lot of good people who, should still be doing this, have sort of been pushed aside or forced into retirement. It's just the way of the world.
Bruce, who was your favorite all-time interview? Was there one where you went home and said, oh, my God? And I'm guessing it was probably Bud Selig. Am I right about that?
That's actually interesting. You bring up Bud Selig. He wasn't my all-time favorite, but Bud Selig and I had
liked him because it was like, whoa.
He was actually a really, really nice guy. I mean, it was like sitting down with your uncle. I went in his office when he was owning the Brewers, or he still was involved with the Brewers. He was the commissioner by this time, but he had an office in Milwaukee, in County Stadium, and I was covering a series with the Giants. And I went down to his office in about the 7th inning, and we talked for probably about an hour about everything. I still have this interview, and it was just really interesting because he was very passionate. He was very much aware and appreciative of the history of the game. A lot of people rip Bud Selig for some of the things he didn't do or did do. I don't think he was that bad a commissioner. A lot of important things happened under his watch. Some of them he deserves credit for. But to me, he was, sort of typical of, a passing trend in America. These owners who are not super rich people, but got into sports for the pure joy and love of being around the athletes. People like Bob Lurie or Horace Stoneham. I wouldn't put Charlie Finley in that category because he was not a very nice man, but the Haas family who owned the A's for a number of years, there are a number of them. And they're just, you don't see that kind of ownership around that much anymore. It's a much more impersonal corporate world that broadcasting has become, that sports has become, and that's just the way of America. But no, Bud Selig was one. I'd say if I had to pick an interview, though, for maybe the most interesting, Ralph, I did a series of interviews on stage, about an hour and a half each over at the Throckmorton Theater in Mill Valley for about 2 years from 2011 through 2013. And probably the 2 guys, I had them there the same night that were just wonderful, were George Atkinson and Fred Biletnikoff of the Oakland Raiders. And you talk about the stories, and they, everything all the stories were unvarnished. There was no, it was good because we didn't have any live television covering this thing, so they didn't, resort to using expletive deleters, but they would use the saucy language and to describe things. Ken Stabler and John Madden and the Holy Roller play. That was so much. To me, the greatest stories that I've covered in sports somehow always kind of get back to the Oakland Raiders because they always had. Maybe it was because the media in those days was more in bed with the teams, and maybe it was because the athletes stayed around longer. And they weren't, covered every day, every moment of every day off the field. They were more accessible. They were more a part of the community. And yet, at the same time, they had a lot more personality. At least the media kind of encouraged that. And the Raiders had such a fascinating group. And I got to be a little part of that. I got to go to a lot of games, but then later cover them as a young reporter. And it was really a privilege, traveling on the road with them and listening to John Madden.
Remember the Big Ben and Dan?
Oh, yeah. Well, he was a little before my time, but as a fan, I saw him play a number of times. I did interview him once at an Old Timers game. He was a crack up. He was so funny.
He was a very unabashed gentleman.
A very nice guy. Passed away a couple years ago. And unfortunately, all these athletes that play in the NFL, most of them don't make it to 70. I think he made it to 72. But, the Raiders had such a collection of characters. Marv Hubbard was another one that I went to do an interview with him once, and he was working at this car dealership because he was a vintage car guy. And he just kept talking, and I swear to God, I couldn't turn off my little tape machine. Well, it wasn't a tape machine. It was some kind of a CD player. For 4 hours, he just went on and on and on. But every story was wonderful. And, Fred Biletnikoff, I mentioned him, Dave Casper, another guy that Dave Casper, what you see is what you get, and Ken Stabler, I got to know him a little bit. So there's some really neat people that I got to become associated with. I got to know Al Davis a little bit, Ralph.
It was like an aura around him.
He did. Even towards the end, he had it, and maybe in some respects more so towards the end, because he kind of still at the end kept a certain distance between himself and the media. He didn't do interviews, and I never actually interviewed Al, but I got to know him personally, and he was very nice to me, and would occasionally call me in the off season just to talk. I mean, which I thought was, I was flattered. Why are you calling? I never said it, but I thought to myself, why is Al Davis calling me? I'm just a Midland sportscaster, but I was working on the broadcast at the time, and he felt like I was part of the Raider family. He knew that I had a passion for the Raiders going back to the 70s, and we talked a number of times. When I got fired at KNBR in 2006, the day after I got fired, he somehow found out about it. Maybe there was a little item in the paper. He was like a hawk. He kept up with everything. And he calls me up, and I pick up the phone. He goes, Bruce? I said, yeah, Al Davis here. I said, real sorry to hear what happened to you, buddy. How would you like to come to work for the Raiders? And he never actually gave me a job, but I went in and actually sat down with Amy Trask, and there was no job offered, but she told me a lot of things that, they were trying to do, and it just never, I think the job they were hoping to create for me just never, was within their budget, or they just never figured out how to incorporate me into the picture. But I was flattered, that he called me up at a time where I really needed a little jolt. And Al was that way. He was very loyal to people he liked. He could be paranoid, and he could be extremely unforgiving, almost to the point of ridiculousness, with other people. He had a feud with Kenny Stabler. He had a celebrated feud with Marcus Allen. But generally speaking, Al treated the people who were close to him and his organization with great respect, and took care of them. There's several players up until, and I think his son Mark is still taking care of him, like Warren Wells, who's been financially indigent and kind of off on the deep end as far as some mental problems. He's been sending him money for years, because Warren Wells caught 38 touchdowns in 3 years and was one of the most dominant receivers in the late 60s, early 70s, and they valued, his contribution.
If he had those demons, Warren Wells would have gone as the greatest football player.
He would have. Well, he would have been the Jerry Rice of his time. He was the Jerry Rice of his time for 3 years. Yeah, he was. For 3 years, he was. You get him in the open field, and he was gone. And not only that, he was like Rice. He could make the great catch. I saw him make a catch in New York once. I wasn't at the game, but I was watching on television. He went up with 3 defenders. The ball was tipped. He actually had reached under the defender, tipped it up high so he could catch it. Then he caught it falling down with 1 second to go, and they won the game. It was the year George Blanda was kicking all those winning field goals, 43-year-old George Blanda. And so this was kind of the capper to this amazing Raider season. So, yeah, there were some great moments there for Warren Wells.
And you talked about Freddie Biletnikoff. What a pair of hands. The stickum, I think, was a lot of mental stuff. It played against his opponent a little bit. That guy could really just flat out catch the ball.
Well, he didn't put it on. He didn't slather it on, kind of like Lester Hayes, a Raider of later vintage who became an All-Pro. And Lester did it so much that they later banned the substance because it was ridiculous. But Freddie told me, he said it gave me psychologically an edge. And, he never, ever fumbled the ball, not once in his career, which is, receivers usually don't fumble. But, not once in his career, in 12, 13 years or whatever he played in the NFL. He was a great possession receiver. If you watch films of him, why he stayed healthy is that when he catch the ball, he didn't have great speed, but he would know when to go down. If he was going to get torpedoed by a defensive back, he would, kind of crumple down and lessen the blow. And he only had one major injury in his career, and that was late in his career when he suffered I think it was a separated shoulder in the conference title game at Denver. I was at that game, and he was knocked out. That Raider team should have won that day, but they had a lot of injuries that year, and that was the Broncos' year to be the Cinderella team, 1977.
You talk about 77. That's 40 some odd years ago.
I know. It's almost 40. Well, it's almost 40 years ago. Yeah, I was there on New Year's Day '78 when the Raiders played on the sidelines. I was shooting film for my TV station when they played Denver. And, great games like that's the thing about football that I do have that fascination for. I think it's because it's an event. The plays mean so much more individually. It's really, Americans love the drama. They love the violence. They love the spectacular, unpredictable nature of it. Baseball, I think, is still the best sport, but football is truly the sport that captures our imaginations, if only for a short time in the fall and winter. And, we're so lucky to have these two great sports, plus the NBA and hockey, and all the other sports here in this country to sort of, to keep us, not only entertained, amused, but also we can learn lessons from these athletes. We certainly can.
If you had to play Nostradamus about the Bay Area situation regarding teams, the A's, will they be moving? Will they be staying? The Raiders, will they be moving? Will they be staying? We're right at the end of 2016, and what say you about what's going to happen in the very near future?
Well, I think the Raiders situation is still very much up in the air. There's a number of, from what we've heard, and you probably know as much as I do, that the majority of owners reportedly are against the move to Las Vegas simply because they look at Oakland, even though it's in the shadow of San Francisco, as part of a number 6 market. Las Vegas isn't in the top 20, and there's always the possibility, even though Raiders fans do travel well, and they probably would get a lot of people from L.A. coming over. I think this team has moved around twice already, and the fans in Oakland are special. Let's face it, L.A. Raider fans were not really, they had a couple of years there where they supported the team, but generally speaking, they really weren't behind that team because they weren't a winner much of the time they were there. They were the first few years, and then they became sort of mediocre. Al kind of lost it in the mid-1980s for a while. But, they've been back in the Bay Area now for 20 years, and they've been pretty bad most of the time, and yet people still show up in great numbers. The Raider fans are very much like the Warrior fans, and I think the NFL, despite all of its problems and all of its, emphasis on money and on ratings and on, making as much of a profit as they can, still values that connection with the blue-collar fan. I think they really do. And I think Roger Goodell, taps into that a bit. My feeling is, even though Mark Davis is still leaning towards Las Vegas, that is not a sure thing. Plus, Sheldon Adelson, the casino guy who has apparently mafia connections, is not somebody that I think the NFL wants to be associated with because of those connections. And he is apparently demanding that he be given, or at least be afforded, the opportunity to buy a small portion of the team. And I don't think Mark Davis is all for that either. So it's an interesting situation. As far as the A's go, I don't think they're going anywhere because there's no place to go. There's no stadium ready in any other market that would be suitable for them. And I think they are probably in the best situation of the 3 East Bay teams. They'll probably get something done, but it's going to take a little bit longer. The Warriors situation, that's too bad. I'm a Bay Area fan. I loved it when they were playing in San Francisco, but they were basically, as you know, Ralph, a Bay Area team through most of the 60s when they were basically headquartered at the Cow Palace. They played at Bill Graham's Civic Auditorium downtown. They played at the Oakland Coliseum. They played in Sacramento. The reason they changed the name to Golden State originally was because Franklin Muley figured they were just going to be an itinerant team that was based out of the Bay Area and was going to travel all over Northern California. That's what he wanted to do. But I think they'll manage to do very well across the Bay. That's not going to happen for at least a few more years. So fans in the East Bay, the East Bay fans are special. I'm not going to knock Giant fans, but it's a different vibe, a different Giant crowd, as you know, than it was when they were at Candlestick.
It's become very corporate at this point.
It has. There's still a lot of blue collar people out there, but generally, to go to a game, my relatives have very good tickets. And they don't go to all the games, but they have a season ticket package for every game, and they usually sell or give them away to friends. When they don't want to go, they probably go to 20 or 30. But that thing, costs, several, close to, I think for the two of them, it's close to $10,000. Who can afford that anymore? Of course, if you buy bleacher seats, it's a little different. But, baseball, unfortunately, and like all sports, has become more expensive. And the great thing about televised sports now is you really don't need to go to the games anymore to keep up with them. You can. I hate to say it, Ralph. I would never have said this 10 years ago, but I actually enjoy watching the Warriors more on TV than watching them in person because they have moved the media so far away from the action. We're halfway up into the crowd, up in the corner. You have replays, and you have a nice seat, and you have the stats in front of you. But you watch it at home in the comfort of your own home. You're getting the great replays, and plus you don't have to deal with the hour-and-a-half drive during commute time, which for Marin County is an absolute nightmare to get to the East Bay. So The only team I think that's really doing well right now, there's no question about, well, the Warriors are, but the Giants, they're in a great position. They're insured of being sold out for several more years, probably just because of their recent success. And we're very lucky, and the Sharks, I haven't even mentioned the Sharks, they've been very successful with their cult audience down there in the South Bay. So we are extraordinarily lucky. And as we are taping this interview today, was watching Stanford hang on for an exciting win in the Sun Bowl today with this young guy, Solomon Thomas, their outstanding defensive lineman. We're just all over the place. So we're singularly blessed in many respects to have all of this great sports activity right in our backyard. And
we've got the weather and the culture that
and the politics.
Sports. We've got museums, and we've got comedy, and we've got music. It's a wonderful, wonderful place, Northern California, and we're blessed.
And we haven't even talked about the Giants players you wanted to remember, have we? We haven't even talked about...
I wanted your thoughts on Jimmy Davenport.
Jimmy Davenport I got to know very well. Of course, he was a manager for a year, so I got to know him very well in '85 when I covered the team regularly. But he was always somebody you could talk baseball with. He was very, very informal, easygoing, likable guy, one of the most likable people around the ballpark. Right up until the end, he and Lon Simmons used to sit together in the press box and in the eating area, and I would sit down in the not the Curly Grieve press room, because that's what it used to be called in Candlestick. It's now the Sam Skinner press room in deference to the late, great Sam Skinner, who was quite a character back in the 80s and 90s covering sports in the Bay Area. Big Sam, and you probably remember hearing about him. But Jimmy and Lon, the last couple of years, they were both battling cancer, and they were tough dudes, and they just loved to sit around and tell stories. And it was fun just to kind of sit with them and listen to them talk, and you could prompt them into telling stories because they'd both been around the organization for so many years and had seen so much. And it was very sad when they both left us, but they both had good, long lives. Jimmy was 83, I believe. Lon was 91, so they didn't get, shortchanged. And they got to be with a great organization. Some other players, Giant players that passed away. I did not get to know Monte Irvin, obviously, because he was in New York, but he would come out occasionally for old-timer games, and just a true gentleman. I mean, if you ever wanted to meet somebody who was just very soft-spoken, almost elegant, Monte Irvin was the guy. And as a matter of fact, there were many people who thought he should have been the guy that broke the color line because he was not combative like Jackie Robinson. And, in fact, Jackie Robinson probably would have lived a longer life if Jackie hadn't been the guy to break the color line and had come into baseball the next year or two, because Jackie had to suck up so much of the crap that he took for the first couple of years before he could dish it back out, just because, he was one of the few guys, the only guy of his race to play. But Monte didn't get to play in the majors till he was 31 years old and had a great career, would have been a Hall of Famer, no question about it, had he played a full career. And Willie Mays, to this day, will tell you that Monte was a mentor and a good friend. And it's sad to see Willie these days, because Willie's lost his wife, he's lost Monte, he's lost a lot of old friends. And I saw Willie at the ballpark last year, and he's 85. His hearing's not real good. His vision's awful. He can't see anything, but he's got a feistiness still. Willie's not a real warm, loving, friendly kind of guy, but he's got a great sense of humor, and if he likes you, he's a wonderful storyteller. And he just said to me, it's kind of sad, all my friends are passing away. He says, but that's what happens when you get to be old like me. And he kind of laughed. And I thought, well, at least he's looking at it from a positive standpoint or a philosophical standpoint. But, haven't we been lucky to see guys like that?
A whole hell of a lot worse, Willie.
Yeah, definitely. And then you mentioned there's some other guys who passed. Jimmy Ray Hart, who could have probably been, a great player. He was for 4 or 5 years, but he had a problem with a bottle. And I'll tell you a great story about Jimmy Hart. Willie Mays told me this story. In 1967 or 68, Jimmy Ray had been on the team about 4 years, and he was averaging about 30 homers, 110 RBIs, hitting about 290, great third baseman, very, very underrated. But he had a problem with the bottle. It never affected his play on the field, but Willie Mays was concerned because Jimmy was getting to that age where the effects of the alcohol were going to slow him down as he hit his 30s, and in fact they did. But Willie used to call Jimmy Old Crow. That was his nickname. And I said, why did you call him Old Crow? And he goes, well, you know about Old Crow whiskey, don't you? And I said, yeah. He says, well, he told me this is a true story. He said, before a series started, I would go up to Jimmy, and I'd say, Jimmy, we need you to be at full strength for this series. We need you in top form. We're playing the Dodgers. So here's what I'm proposing. I'm going to give you a bottle of Old Crow, but you don't get it until the final day of the series. You have to give me 6 hits in this series, and you have to hit a home run or 2. And if you do that, the bottle is yours. And he said Jimmy always managed to win that bottle. And that was Willie's way of kind of trying to wean Jimmy Ray off it. Unfortunately, Jimmy Ray couldn't get off it. The nice thing about Jimmy Ray is he lived into his 70s. He had some health problems, but he was moderately successful off the field. He didn't have horrific personal problems like some of these former athletes did. He just, by the time he was in his mid-30s.
He worked at Safeway. He was a union guy.
Yeah. He was an interesting guy. I've only interviewed him one time, and he struck me as just a kind of a blue-collar guy from the Deep South, had that, hominy and grits, accent. And, his last team he played for was the New York Yankees back in the mid-'70s, just before they became the powerhouse. He finally was released mid-season by the Yankees, but Jimmy had a good career. He had 4 or 5 really good years. And, if you play 4 or 5 seasons, make an all-star team or 2, and hit 30 home runs for 3 or 4 years, you're doing pretty well in Major League Baseball in my book.
Absolutely. And you didn't know much about Monte Irvin.
Well, as I said, I got to meet him a couple of times at old-timer games. By that time, he was very old. But as I said, he always struck me as the quintessential gentleman, and he was also a great storyteller. He always used to tell the story, and this is what I love about ball players, because they tell the same story over and over, but they embellish it and change it and add to it. And he had this story about May's great catch off Vic Wertz in the '54 World Series, the amazing catch out in deep center field. And Monty was running back in with Willie into the infield, and Willie by this time was only 23, just a kid, but very cocky. And Monty said, when that ball was hit, I didn't think you had a chance at it. And Willie looked at him, he goes, come on, Monty, I had it all the way. And Monty said, well, that's good enough for me, So Monty told me, he did tell me that Willie was the best player he ever saw, and I think that's not a big surprise to hear that, because Willie was the best all-around player in the history of the game, no question.
Willie was that. He brought a joy to the field that was incredible. Monte Irvin was offered the job, or if you will, he was offered Branch Rickey offered him being the first black to play. And
yeah, that's right.
Monte Irvin knew his capabilities. He knew what he had been through. He knew what he had taken over the course of a lifetime, and the pile of crap that he had to eat every day to play in those Negro Leagues. He also knew that he was a bit over the hill and did not accept the position. But Branch Rickey offered it to him before he offered it to Jackie Robinson.
Well, as I said before, I think, Monty would have been perfect for that. Not that Jackie wasn't, because Jackie was dynamic and, abrasive and, proud and stood up for himself, and you wanted to have that kind of an athlete. But I think the toll that it took on Jackie physically, caused him to die young. I mean, you saw pictures of him towards
Jackie
the end in the early.
2 years, and
he had to hold it in.
Monty would not have been able to do what Jackie did.
Maybe not. Who knows? I mean, Monty was a proud guy too, but he wasn't, wound as tightly as Jackie. I think Jackie, if you saw him the last few years, saw pictures of him, he was 53 going on 80. I mean, he just looked, he was practically blind. He had diabetes. He had all sorts of health problems, and it wasn't because he didn't take care of himself, because he was a terrifically conditioned athlete. It was because of all the stress that he had been under being this iconic figure, and he dealt with it, but he never complained about it. But, it took a toll. It did.
No question. Hey, Bruce, thank you, sir. You're terrific.
Hey, it's a pleasure, Ralph. I love telling the stories and hearing your thoughts about America's great game.
And you've been terrific over the years on this show, and we love having you. And the Giants could not have asked for a better person to honor some of the late Giants that passed away this year. And life goes on, and thanks for chronologizing it for us.
My pleasure, Ralph. You have a great New Year, and I'm sure we'll be talking in the not-too-distant future again.
All right, Bruce. Thank you again. A Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production. Giants baseball, past, present, future. My guest, the immortal. Immortal? You're not yet immortal, but you're terrific.
Well, I haven't died yet, so I guess I am immortal. So, you can claim to be immortal until you're dead, right?
And after that, you're not doing much claiming anyway. So,
no, you can't claim anything because there's nobody around that's going to listen to you. Well, there are people that are going to listen, but they don't hear you. So anyway.
But the only thing they'll hear is you'll be on YouTube, because that's where we take care. We archive all the shows on YouTube. So that'll live on. That's kind of nice. All our stories,
that is nice.
All our memories get to live a little bit, and nice that you help pass it on, Bruce.
Well, that's great. The great thing about podcasts, there's that record of it, and it'll always be around. Thanks so much, Ralph. You have yourself a great New Year, buddy.
Okay, Bruce. Stay healthy, and we'll talk to you next year, as they say. See you.
You got it, man.
All right. Keep on keeping on, everybody. Have a wonderful New Year. Adios.